leading that for us. Good morning and welcome. Can you all even believe it's November? I'm looking a little bit of like I don't want to say a dysphoria about it, but yeah, every time I look at the calendar, I'm like, how did we get here to 2022 November? But we're here. I really like winter, so we're about to enter my favorite time of year for many reasons, but I wanted to do a check-in, and so I'd love to hear your name just to help you use your voice in this space. The pronouns that you would want us to use to talk to you and about you. And then maybe if you could share one lesson that winter teaches you. So I'll model. I'm Kelly Nicole, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. And one thing that winter teaches me is to be intentional about a period of rest. It's like everything like goes dormant, so we think, and it's very quiet and things appear dead, but really they're just resting for spring. And it's a reminder to me to also slow down, rest more, go a little dormant, maybe appear to be a little like dead to the world so that I can prepare for the next season, which is spring. And to restore from, summer and fall, which were also very full. So anyone who'd like to go next, and then if you could just pick someone in your community to pass it to when you're done, I'll model and I'm going to pass it over to Judy.
Oh, good morning. So happy to be here today. I love this season. I've been picking up the leaves that fall off the ginkgo trees. Sometimes there's just complete gold, and then sometimes they're all over the ground. I find this time of year incredibly exciting.
Thank you. And if you'll pass it to someone for me, please.
Keiko.
Hi, everyone. Oh, yeah, I think the time to reflect of the year. And I resonate with Kelly that it's a time to kind of taking a little break from day to day busy life and slow down and enjoy the stillness whenever we can. All right, Verena.
Hey, yeah, for me, it was a really very busy 2 weeks with my clients, but I really like, how it's like this weekend, especially, I'm like sitting in front of the heater and really try to slow down and prepare for the next week. It's gonna be busy again, and I like to be here. Raisa.
Hello, so my name is Raisa, and time of reflection, kind of gathering and because slowing down and resting, noticing more things, getting more into what's important. That's it. Oh, and then Snehan.
Okay, thank you, Raisa. I think we forgot this part, but you can apply the masculine pronouns to me. Winter, I find, is a time of reflection, introspection, and ultimately survival. It's the hard time for many, and many don't make it through the winter time. That's what the lesson has been traditionally for my tribe. Sarni and Alan.
I light and I'm wanting to shore up all the time that I can be in sunlight because it's less and less. And I had a really interesting conversation with my 6-year-old grandson about how he doesn't like daylight savings time and how it's harder to sleep. And but I agree that resting is an important part too, but I do really find that I just appreciate and treasure light more.
Yeah, fall's always been my favorite season, and a lot of it is associated with the activities that occur going back to school and football season, and just the beauty of the changing colors. So this is the time of the year that I enjoy the most.
Who do you want to send it to?
Oh, well, you pick.
Let's see. Abaya, Hillen, Nancy.
Hello, everyone. I'm in the kitchen here, so I'll just put the camera on briefly. So my pronouns are she, her, and my motto for winter is embrace the darkness. I know that sounds a little odd, but Ramananda sent out a beautiful poem a few years ago, and I just love it about, really just embracing and resting in the dark and the cold and learning to love it. And I really have. It's kind of transformed winter for me. All right, I'll pass it on to, let's see, the other Abaya.
Hi, everyone. I'm not feeling well, so I'll keep this brief. My pronouns are she and her, and definitely rest when it comes to winter. And that's exactly what I'm doing right now, trying to get over whatever it is I have. So, but I'm happy to be here and listen. Thank you. And I'll pass it to Gary.
Hello, Gary here. I think of fall and winter as change, but it's change measured by the wind. So in the summer, the wind always comes from the west. Today is coming from the east, and earlier in the week it was coming from the north and coming from the south. And this matters profoundly if you're on a sailboat in San Francisco Bay. So I've just become very interested in how, of course, we always think of seasons as measuring change, but I never really thought about it in terms of change in the wind. And this is very, I think, dramatically enhanced my interest in the seasons and put a new perspective on it. Thank you.
Gary didn't pick someone, but I'll go ahead. There's not only a couple of us left. I'm Ramananda. My pronouns are he and his. Yeah, winter just teaches me to be more inward, to meditate more, to rely on internal messages rather than external events and experiences. That's it for me. And I think Prajna hasn't spoken yet. Oh, you're muted.
You're muted.
Hi, Prajna, she, her, winter, quiet, going inside, and seeing what bubbles up, I think. Is there anyone who hasn't? Sure.
I I think everyone has shared. Thank you for wrapping it up for us, Bhagavan. Thank you all for your sharing. It's always beautiful to hear how winter lands with the different folks. So, it's a season that I struggle with as a younger person. I don't like to be cold. It's my least favorite feeling as a human, is being cold, followed up by hungry. These are two combinations you don't want to be around me when I'm not able to resource myself. If I'm cold and hungry, I'm not going to be in the best mood. But I moved from the American South to the Northeast last year. It's been a year and a half. And I'm building my capacity for the winter. I actually spent some time in Minnesota last week, and the highest temperature was 30 degrees. It snowed every single day. We only saw the sun one time. We built a collective altar, and just as we were activating the altar, the sun came out for us for like 3 minutes. But other than that, it was just like gray, snowy, cold, and extremely windy. And it was good for me because it helped me to know that being super cold won't end me. And I was on a farm, and on that farm, everything's dormant and brown and kind of like decaying and falling over. And still they have a labyrinth at this farm that I was at. It's a huge labyrinth that they grow flowers in the spring and summer. And even though everything was like brown, there were still like things coming to seed and like milk thistle to pull apart and look at, and like 3 flowers still blooming, even though it was snowing. It's just a good reminder that we also, as humans, go through periods of a lot of action and energy expenditure. And we also must carve out the time to rest and process all the things that we've taken in. I'm saying that to say, we're about to get back into the work that we did back in October. And then we're going to take a break till January because Kelley doesn't work in December. And I want to just remind you that this tough conversation that we're going to have today is really just an opening for you to do exactly what Prajna just said. Just like take it in, let it seed in you, and then see what comes up. And then we can talk about it in January. But don't be in a rush to change or fix or come to an answer for yourself. Just let it, be dormant in you, and know that even though the conversation might be difficult, the content of the material might feel uncomfortable, it won't end you. It's just take time with it. Does that make sense what I'm saying and sharing? Perfect. It also makes me want to tell y'all about this frog that I learned about last year. The frog lives in a really cold place, and every night it freezes. And every night the frog freezes to death. And every day when the sun comes back up, the frog comes back to life. And I was like, wow, why don't we know that? Because that's not the only animal that does that. But 2, what would happen if we recognize that sometimes we just really need to freeze up, freeze over, and rest, and then come back to life. So anyway, I just wanted to tell you all about that. When we left off last time, we had begun to talk about privilege, and I gave an assignment for you all to read a document. I'm sharing a link to it in the chat because I don't want to make assumptions that everybody had access to it. Called Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. And it's by this person named Peggy McIntosh, and she's talking about privilege. And I want to get into talking about your thoughts about it and where you might be in the homework exercise of noticing your own privilege. And also, Snehan, I see your hand up, so please.
You know what? That's perfect segue because I missed the last session. I was in India. I didn't know if you guys had a time to share from the first time. So thank you for letting me share briefly. There's the echo. Judy, can you mute yourself, please? Thank you. So honestly, it was astounding to me that after our first session, when I had so much inspiration and felt like I was learning things and eager to see how I could apply it within a day. And it was maybe the second day, I had an experience, an incident with a woman at a place I was going to for restorative health, right? And she was at the front desk. And something happened between us where she was resistant of letting me take my folding electric bike into the lock closet that they had, as I had been doing previously there, and had been told that that was okay. So she was resistant, and then I found myself, I mean, I don't want to say bullying, but I tapped right into this, you know, oh, but why not? And it was always okay before, and you understand that for me, it's really difficult. And she said, I'll let you do it, but just this one time, and please don't try to, like, she didn't use the word bully, but, you know, like override me. And I said thank you, and I was able to lock the bike, and I went inside, and the whole time I'm inside having my treatment, I'm thinking, wow, that was an example of copping into a privileged situation that I probably do all the time. And here it is right away. So I took the opportunity when I left to go to her, and I said, you know what? I want to apologize to you, because what I did earlier was for me an example of, I'm really sorry that it was so forceful, and it was an example of what I would call white privilege. And right away she was like, oh no, don't worry. And this, by the way, was an Asian woman. It was an Asian place. And so right away she waved me off as that wasn't really necessary. I said, no, please let me continue. I'm actually in a course right now that's teaching me these tools. And while this is actually really difficult for me in the moment, because I could feel myself starting to well up with shame and discomfort over calling my own self out. And she listened to me then, and she appreciated it, and acknowledged me. I cried a little bit. I didn't want to make a big dramatic thing out of it, and so I didn't, and then I left. And on my way home, I felt pretty good about myself, but at the same time I thought, now that's great, right? Okay, so I started to apply these teachings, but can I do it next time during? Can I call myself out as I'm doing it and stop that so I don't necessarily get what I want, and say, oh, okay, I won't do it. Thank you. You know, that's the next step for me. Namaste.
No, thank you for that sharing, Sneha. I think, you know, last time we were talking about the fact that this particular like work that you all are endeavoring to do is a practice. And so similar to, you know, downward dog, we've all probably done it. Even when I said it, you could visualize your body going into the posture, but that's because you've done it a million times. And you can do it with your eyes closed. You can do it against the wall, with a chair, with blocks, with whatever. If it's rainy, if it's cold, if you're tired, if you're hungry, you can do it. But it's because you've been in a practice around it. And I think that for all of us, regardless of our identities, being able to recognize the way that we are not operating in our highest good, the ways that we're not operating that are in right relationship, not just with other people, but the planet that we're on. That's a practice, because we're also living in a society that encourages us not to pay attention to those things and not to name those things or not talk about those things. So I would say extend yourself a lot of compassion and grace, but also feel good about the fact that you noticed that time, because the ability and your capacity, our collective capacity to notice, is going to grow over time. I'm similarly in a practice around plastic. As a person living in the United States, we have access to a lot of plastic. Most every single thing is packaged in plastic, which makes our, like, they say it makes our lives more convenient. And also, we are the number one consumers of goods. I'm talking about us as Americans, and the number one producers of pollution. And it's hard to say, like, oh, I've been living in a way that causes damage to other places, particularly other places with less financial resources. And how do I like want to change or shift that practice? And it's really, yesterday I was walking in New York City and I was so thirsty, and it took me 3 stores to find water that wasn't in a plastic bottle, which wasn't a huge inconvenience. It's only 3 stores of walking around anyway. But also, these are like the small things that we have to like do. And I think I might have shared with y'all, but maybe not. I strongly dislike grocery shopping. It is one of my least favorite adult activities, although I really love to cook. And I was saying to my partner today, we went for the first time and shopped at a package-free store that's near our home in New Jersey. And, I had to drive there, which I'm grateful I have a car and I have gas to get there. But it was like a rush. That's why I was a couple minutes late getting on here, because we were like rushing to get back home. And I said to my partner, I recognize that I'm going to have to not only think about not purchasing things in plastic, but I'm going to have to think about the way I consume food, how I hoard it at my house each week, buying more than what I actually need, more than we actually eat, because we throw away, like green vegetables that go bad, or like we eat a lot of salad greens at my house, but inevitably there's like 2 handfuls that just don't get eaten in time before they get like limp and not good. And how can I recognize the privilege I have in terms of access and change how I'm showing up? And yes, Nahan, thank you for sharing those. I think sometimes when we are in the US and we've lived in the US for a long time or all of our lives, we think that the way the US operates is like the normal and standard. And really, we are quite an anomaly in terms of how we consume, how we use resources, how we divide up those resources, but also how we evaluate people's worthiness to have things like shelter. Anyway, I appreciate you sharing it, Sahan. I was just sharing I'm also in a little practice around like the privilege of convenience and how I want to offload that, because it doesn't help the world. It doesn't help me either, but it doesn't help the world. And I think we all just have to stay in the practice, even when it feels difficult, even when we have to have a hard conversation with, a stranger or someone we're in a more tight relationship with. Were there others who had a chance to read the document? I shared the link there in the chat, who might have had thoughts or who were doing some of that homework around noticing your privilege that would want to share any thoughts, and also if there's any questions. Go ahead, Ramadan.
Well, I mean, the main thing I noticed from that document is how easy it is not to notice the privilege that I have, because I take it for granted that I can move about in the world. I can use the bank or the store. I can do so many things without any obstacle. And it doesn't feel like something special or a unique privilege. It feels just normal. So mainly, I was struck by how unnoticeable my privilege is. And unless someone writes something like that, I don't even think of it. But of course, having read that, I'm thinking of it more. But I just see how hard it is for me to notice it unless I really look for that. Because it's the way I've lived my whole life, and it doesn't feel like anything special. It just feels normal. Anyway, that's my main observation.
Thank you for sharing that. A little bit later in our time today, I'm going to share some questions that I ask myself as a space holder, because of exactly what you said. Sometimes we can't see the privilege that we're bringing into a space. And these questions help me to at least investigate it for myself, so that I'm not just saying like, well, I made this great thing and exactly how I'm offering it makes it accessible to everyone. I have to like sit and actually think about like, even physical accessibility. I think I shared with y'all that I teach accessible yoga training through Jivana School. And part of the requirement for that training is that the space where the training is offered has to be physically accessible. The entrance, all space that is used, as well as the restroom. And also it's a yoga teacher training. And so 90% of yoga studios are not accessible for the training, which is why the training is often not at a yoga studio, because most of their spaces are not physically accessible. And so we can't offer it there. And I'm in my mind, when I first like made that connection, because I hadn't thought about it before I taught accessible yoga. In fact, I was teaching it weekly at a space that required people to ascend 42 very steep steps. And hadn't really thought about the fact that there were, I taught at other times in different spaces, but hadn't really thought about at that time, like, oh, there's probably people who come to my Sunday class, which has a wheelchair ramp, and there are people in wheelchairs who come, that would come to this Wednesday class, but they cannot, they literally cannot come to this class because of where I am teaching. And it's not something that I've ever thought about, because in this current moment and for most of my life, ascending and descending stairs, regardless of how steep they are, hasn't been something that can prohibit me from entering the space. And so anyway, I'll share these questions later with y'all when we're talking, because they're great questions for you to hold around all the things that you do, so that you can truly be holding space for any and everyone, and not just people who have certain physical ability, certain social economic status, certain, like ability to transportation. Like transportation is a huge situation. And I know you all live in a city that, it's been my experience. I've never had a car when I'm in that area. I've been there several times, and people can get around, but also there's probably places that are less accessible through public transportation than others. I'm a bicycle commuter, so I do notice where places are like, this is not a place that I would ride a bike, or like my partner and I ride bikes, but we're riding with an 8-year-old and a 6-year-old. So also, like, is it accessible for younger riders who might not have the same like dexterity and control and traffic? And it's something, to be thinking about. Are there other thoughts about the privilege work that we did? All right. So I want to give you all a chance to go into some small groups, really just partners. I don't know, Ramananda, if you know how to make small groups through the breakout room function. It would be great if they could be 2 to 3 people in each group. And in the group, it's very curated what you're going to talk about. I just want you all to share about how you think privilege shows up in yoga. Okay. And I mean, you can be broad with the term yoga. I don't just mean like physical asana classes, like how it shows up across, like you all have a community, and also they try to refer to like yoga as a whole as community. I look at it as an industrial complex, it's a capitalist business model, but how does it show up across the whole thing? So you could think about Reiki and other wellness spaces, anything connected, meditation spaces, even trainings and workshops, like all of these things. And I want to give you about 10 minutes in your groups to talk with one another about that, and your partners. And then we could come back and share any thoughts that might come up in those small groups. Does that sound okay for everyone?
Yes, I can create the breakout rooms. Kelly, remind me, how many people to a room?
2 to 3.
2 to 3. Okay.
Because we have I think we have an even number, so you should be able to put 2. But then, of course, Alan and Sarmony would be in a room where there's 3, the 2 of them and one other person. Because don't put me in a group.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, just take me a moment more.
No worries.
Okay, I'm ready to open the rooms.
Okay. Does anyone have any questions before you head there? Okay. It is the 40th minute. So we'll come back at the 50th minute.
Okay. Okay, everyone should be able to go there.
I think everyone made it. Are you gonna, oh, Welcome back.
That was great. Thank you.
Good. I'm glad y'all enjoyed it. Welcome back, everyone. The way Rama's background is, I really, for a second, thought they were walking back to the lake, but it's a background. That's cool. It's a pretty scene for that. Okay, how was it to be in groups? Would anyone like to share anything that came up from being in the groups? Any thoughts that you want to share with the whole group here?
I can just say it made it easy to have time to talk and share something that we both kind of saw. Yeah, I think I had thoughts, she had thoughts, so together we had more thoughts.
Thank you for sharing it. I like to offer the breakout groups to give you a chance to talk just with another person, not be on recording. We will do that a couple more times tonight as we move through the content. Does anyone have any last questions about privilege or the conversation we're having about privilege before we move on to our next document that we're going to look at?
Kelly, your voice is
Yeah.
soft and there's a little bit of static there that makes me have to kind of really lean forward and try and get what
Okay.
you're saying. Thank you.
Can you hear me better if I get this
Absolutely.
volume?
Absolutely.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for letting me know. Well, what I was saying is, are there any questions about the privilege document or anything we've talked about so far before we look at our next little piece of documentation?
I just again share something that we talked in a breakout room. So I was with Nancy via. We talked about the yoga being perceived as kind of intellectual pursuit by some privileged. And we didn't really talk about the racial disparity, but more of the social economic. So how we can, bring together that the studio model versus community center model, and what I can do, just a tiny bit, but yeah. So that's something we talked about.
Thank you for naming that. When we're together for our third session in January, we're going to start to look at some of the ways that you all individually, but also as a community, could think about change. And because then in our final session, we'll talk about some like substantial things that you all might feel called to do, want to investigate for yourselves as individuals, but also as a community. But that conversation around change that we'll have next time is important because for 10 years, I've been trying to help people and I've been trying to help myself think about how we hold these wellness spaces and hold them with integrity and also make them socioeconomically and educationally accessible to anyone. And it's complex to do because there are certain people that are literally making billions of dollars on the model that most of us are familiar with, where you buy equipment that costs a lot of money, you come to yoga and pay a lot for that, and the teachers spent a lot on trainings and equipment also. And so there's not a real way to think about, how do I not charge the people that I want to serve? How do I take the trainings without going broke? And how do I make sure that the space where I teach has the equipment to support the practice, whether it's a physical practice or a contemplative practice that we're going to do. And it can be done. I'm experiencing it all the time happening. And also for myself, I'll say I've had to really think about how I think about change and how I think about past decisions that I make that didn't work out, that failed, and using that more as data than a story that it can't work. Does that make sense? Yeah. So we'll talk about all of that next time, but I appreciate you bringing that into the conversation, Nancy and Kate. Man. Oh, you're muted.
Thanks. It was very easy to talk. We talked a lot, the two of us in our group. And I think that it's a little overwhelming when it seems like everything in yoga is based on a privilege. But to boil it down, or to say it a little bit more concisely, it seems to boil down to racial and sexual and financial. So racial, because where are the people of color and where are they represented in everything we see as yoga, you know, as a broader culture? We just don't see it. So already excluded there. And then sexual, because it comes from a paternalistic culture. It's rife throughout the whole thing. And what I saw in now examining that is that while we have classes that are primarily populated by females, often and historically, the teachers were males. And the most popular teachers were male until a few famous teachers in the West came, like Shiva Ray and Sharon in New York. Maybe some before her, but previous to that, you see very patriarchal. And then financial, because it's obvious, yeah. What you said, costs, and it costs, and so how we recoup our costs. Thank you.
No, thank you for naming that too. Are there any other thoughts that y'all would want to share around privilege? Go ahead.
One thing that we talked about was cultural appropriation and the lack of acknowledgement for the gifts that we have been given. And then just the idea that we are so privileged in a really positive way because we do have these gifts, and to appreciate them, and to integral yoga is one of the places where the teachings are central rather than it just being poses on a mat that you do maybe once or twice a week. And so to have that privilege of really being exposed and embracing these really ancient and beautiful teachings is a positive privilege, is maybe a way to put it. But that was something I hadn't thought of, and the other two people in our group really brought that up, and I thought that was really a beautiful thing. So I wanted to share that.
Yeah, thank you. That's one of the reasons why I feel most accountable to do the type of work that I do in yoga and wellness spaces, is because this is a self-study practice, and there's so many gifts and tools in place for us to use as we navigate this. I think that, well, I've had the experience of doing very similar work in corporate spaces. And it's much harder to do for me as the facilitator, because most people are socialized that when you're at work, you should be very professional. And so you wear a mask for who you are. And people aren't really willing to think about or talk about, their egos or the ways that they could better take care of themselves. And the focus is really, every time when I've been asked to come into a corporate space, it really is around how do they make more money, and they recognize that they must have some diversity and inclusion to add to that money pot, not really from the space of like, how do we take better care of the people who work here and the people that we serve? And it feels like, to me at least, that's a part of yoga that I don't have to like help people build up. We can just like get into talking about the things, because you all have a meditation practice. So if I say like, hey, you need to meditate on the feelings that you're coming up, it's not like, what? Meditate? We don't do that here. You already like give it. So or you already get that particular thing. Or self-study. There's I didn't really have a word for self-study before I came to this practice. And I have to use very different language in like a corporate space or a non-yoga space, because most folks are not, we aren't socialized to hold self-study as something to be doing. We are supposed to be, I guess, looking outward for all the answers and not inward at ourselves. So thank you for naming that. Ellen, Sarani, and whoever you were in a group with. Is there anyone else who'd like to add any last thoughts about privilege?
Actually, I thought of something which happened to me last night. I was out at a restaurant, and the table next to me were about half my age, like the age of my nephew. And I overheard them talking about my home state, which isn't mentioned very often. And so it caught my ear. I listened for a little bit, and I heard a lot of entitlement in the discussion. There were these things that were being said that were based on entitlement, but then at the end of the statement, as if somebody were listening to them, and I was, not that they may or may not have known it, but as if somebody were listening or they caught themselves, they said something to like write that, to make it like okay. And I can't remember the specific examples, but it was like saying, you know, this really shouldn't be that way, but you know, there are people who really need that help, you know, something like that at the end. And it's this lip service. That's all I'm bringing out now, is that if there's any consciousness about it, which is arising in the generations, I think it sounded like a little bit of lip service, but thank God, at least they're starting.
Yeah, I I when I was in Minnesota, I was with a group of people. The two of the young people that were there, they told me that they were born like recent. It feels recent to me. They're like 21 and 24 or something like that. And we were having a conversation actually about ageism, around the reality that people like value the expertise and perspectives of people within a certain age bracket. And if you're younger than that, people think you don't know anything. And if you're older than that, people think you're senile or about to die. And so they were saying, like, as young people who work and advocate for houseless young people in the city where they live in Minnesota, people often don't listen to them about what young people need in terms of housing. And I was saying to them that first, the fact that these two young people are so focused on making sure that all the young people that they know have housing without it being a transaction feels so refreshing. Because even though I am connected to a lot of people who say they want to like help houseless folks, they still want it to be a transaction. Like if they do job training, then we'll give them a house. Or if they can get a job and pay a little bit of rent, then we'll help them with the rest of the rent. And it's like, all humans need shelter. That's a clear, like it's a clear thing. We can't live outside. We can live in different iterations of outside, but we need shelter from the cold, from the rain, from the wind. What has to happen for us to all arise to the consciousness that the way that housing is distributed, the way that we've agreed to distribute housing and participate in that system, means that some people will never have housing. And what does it look like for us to shift our perspective, be more expansive in understanding that there are ways to house everyone? It's just going to look very different than what we've been socialized to think is normal, right, best, or good. But it does start with us just having a conversation about it. And I'm saying that to say the young people gave me hope when I was in Minnesota last week. It's like, oh man, if these 20-year-olds can like grasp it and they're really committed to it, and they're saying they're not the only ones, that they got a ton of friends all over the world who are committed to it too, this could really shift something. It's how I also feel about climate change. I am parenting an 8-year-old who, I mean, maybe 2 weeks ago, we talk a lot on the way home from the bus. We walk from the bus stop to home, and they were saying, I asked them pretty regularly, like, what do you feel excited about? What do you feel sad about? What feels scary to you right now? And they said, what feels scary to me and what felt confusing is that we're at school learning things that they were like, I guess are important, but also if the world, if we can't live in the earth by the time we're 30, was it important for me to learn long division? Or would it have been more important for me to learn how to harvest water? And I'm like, okay, if this 8-year-old can grasp that learning to harvest water is a priority, we might be on the right path. So anyway, you just made me think of that when you're sharing. So, yeah. I thank you. I shared in the chat the link to a document. The document is titled White Supremacy Culture. I'm sharing it there because I want to give you, can everyone see it and access it on their own from the device that you're using? Or have you had an opportunity to see it and access it before now? Okay, we're gonna go through and read them. So I'm gonna ask for volunteers. I don't have the ability.
Could you
Yes.
could you share it on your screen?
That's what I was just about to say. I'm not a co-host, so I can't share screen, but Ramananda, if you make me a co-host, I can share it, or you can share your screen. And basically these, what we're gonna be looking at are characteristics of white supremacy, white culture that show up within organizations, but also show up within us as individuals. And I'm sharing them with you as a study tool, as a tool to be clear about some of the things that we've been taught to hold as normal that really are about oppressing us and others, so that we can all make a decision for ourselves about what we need to release or work on or let go of. So like an example of one of the things that we're going to read about is perfectionism. And usually when I say raise your hand if you've struggled with perfectionism, everybody like puts their hand up. But also it's not a reality that we have to navigate. It's just something that we've been agreeing to navigate. And so we'll look at how they show up, but then we'll also read through some of the antidotes for how we could disrupt them. This is going to take a little bit of time because there's about 15 or 20 of them listed. We may not read all of them, but I want to invite you, and part of your homework between this time and next time is going to be similar to the privilege. It's not that you have to do something necessarily, but the invitation I would make is for you to print it or make it accessible to you in a space that you regularly sit to work or study, so that you can evaluate how you might be upholding these things, leaning into these things, believing these things, not about the world around you, but about yourself. Does that make sense? So like using perfectionism as an example, perfectionism really is rooted in the idea that if you make a mistake, you're less valuable in the space. We all want to be valued and cared for and have belonging. And so we strive to be perfect, thinking that if we are perfect, people will always value us, that will always belong. The downside of that is we aren't perfect, not under the illusion of perfectionism. And we are going to make mistakes. It is what we do as humans. But can we create the communities and connections that say, I see you trying. I know that you burnt the dinner, said the wrong thing, didn't do what you said you were going to do. This doesn't make you less valuable to me. It just means we have to have a conversation about what to do next. And can we hold that? I just was sharing this with my 8-year-old that perfect actually is defined as the best it can be given the current circumstances and resources. And in that way, most everything is perfect because hopefully you're doing the best you could do in that moment. But your best is changing all the time, depending on the weather, your sleep, how much you've eaten, how well you're resourced in other ways, other things you might be navigating like grief or illness, like your best changes. And so I was saying to them, because they were getting prepared for a test, that I didn't care if they got a perfect score under the school's evaluation. I just wanted them to be perfect in their effort, meaning giving the most effort that they could give, given the current circumstances, given what, they've missed 2 weeks of school because of the flu, given the fact that they've been sick for almost 2 weeks, it's going to be perfect. Yeah. So are we all ready? Ramananda, you ready to share screen or give me sharing capability? Oh, you gave me sharing capability. Thank you. Thank you. Let me share. Do you all see the document? Yes. Okay. This document was developed by someone named Tima Okun. It's a very old document. It came out in the early 2000s. Not very old, but it's not like a new thing that was written recently. And basically, they're talking about who developed it and sharing a little bit of information around the fact that these particular characteristics are damaging because they make it so that our spaces can't be accessible to everyone, not even to us. And it creates a situation where people are always striving to be and do something that isn't actually possible as a human, right? So I'll model. I'm going to read the first one. And then if you want to be thinking about if you'd like to be a volunteer to read the next one. The first one is perfectionism. So it's little appreciation expressed among people for the work that others are doing. Appreciation that is expressed usually directed to those who get the most credit anyway. So an example might be you all hold a festival for whatever at your ashram, and no appreciation is given to like the people who set up the chairs or the folks who cleaned the floor or cleaned the bathroom. But at the end, everyone stands up and thanks Ramananda for organizing it. I'm not saying that that's happening. I'm just giving you an example of like, what about everybody who like contributed? The person who sent the emails that like did all of it. If we're going to appreciate the things, let's appreciate everyone. More common is to point out either how the person or their work is inadequate. I know you all have probably navigated working with someone or being in community with someone where it's like you do something and all they can tell you is what was wrong with it, why it wasn't what it should have been, how they would have done it differently. This falls under that perfectionism model. Or even more common to talk to others about the inadequacies of a person or their work without ever talking to them directly. And I'm sure we've navigated that too, of like, you do a thing for work, and then you hear through the grapevine that the other person wasn't happy with the work that you did, but they never said anything to you about it. Or, what I've experienced is putting something together, working with a group of people, not hearing back from the person who I report to, but then later in like an evaluation or a time to like move forward, then they come and say like, well, back at 3 years ago, I was very unhappy with the thing you did. And it's like, you never told me. I had no opportunity to know that it didn't meet your standard. Like we didn't have a chance. These are those types of things. And mistakes are perceived as personal, i.e. they reflect badly on the person making them, as opposed to being seen for what they are, which is mistakes. And then making a mistake is confused with being a mistake, doing wrong with being wrong. And little time, energy, or money are put into reflection or identifying the lessons that are learned that can improve practice. In other words, little or no learning time from mistakes. And then a tendency to identify what's wrong, little ability to identify, name, and appreciate what's right. So it's like I shared with y'all on parenting. Children are interesting because they're learning all the time, and sometimes they need lessons more than one time. So right now, my children are learning how to wash the dishes well. It's a task that I don't like to do, and their small hands can do easily. They still got to learn, though, how to make sure things are not greasy, use the right temperature, clean all the corners, like which type of implement to use on what type of thing. So when I notice that clean dishes are actually dirty, I don't just come and say like, I know you wash the dishes, but these dishes are dirty. I'll say like, you did a really great job in terms of time. I'll like list the things that were great. And then I'll go into like, and also this dish isn't clean enough for someone to eat on it. Would you eat on it if it looked this way? Do you think you want to spend more time? And it creates a story that like, you did do a good job. And also you're just going to have to try that good job again until you get it to the place where it needs to be. versus like you're a bad dishwasher and you're just never going to get it. But that happens in our groups and organizations all the time, and it disempowers people. And the people with the most privilege are usually the ones doing the talking about what's not right, what needs to be changed, and wielding that power in a way that disempowers folks who might not be white or might not be male or might not have the same able-bodiedness, or who might navigate long-term pain or be queer or trans. They don't have the same power in a space to say like, this isn't right. And then lastly, often internally felt, in other words, the perfectionist fails to appreciate their own good work, more often pointing out their faults or failures, focusing on inadequacies and mistakes rather than learning from them. The person works with a harsh and constant inner critic. I know I've navigated that. I still navigate it sometimes. When my children both had the flu last week, I was just like, oh, I didn't do it. I had to like say to myself, like, no, they got sick because there's a lot of bugs going around and they've been secluded. It's not because I didn't build their immune system up or have them on the right regimen or wash their hands well enough. Like, it's just going to happen. But that internal critic, this notion of perfectionism, it's something that's been embedded in all of us as part of a cultural norm that we really could disrupt at any time if we choose to. And so this second part lists the antidotes. Develop a culture of appreciation where the organization takes time to make sure that people's work and efforts are appreciated. Develop a learning organization where it is expected that everyone will make mistakes and those mistakes offer opportunities for learning. Create an environment where people can recognize that mistakes are sometimes lead to positive results. Separate the person from the mistake. When offering feedback, always speak to the things that went well before offering criticism. Ask people to offer specific suggestions of how to do things differently. When offering criticism, realize that being your own worst critic does not actually improve the work. It often contributes to low morale among the group and does not help you or the group realize the benefit of learning from mistakes. So that's the first one. I read it. I'd love a volunteer. You can just read straight through. I also see that you
Kelly,
have
there's
your
a
hand up, Nishala.
yeah.
Yes. I'm sorry, Nishala. I just saw.
Oh, no need to apologize. I was raising my hand to volunteer.
Oh, okay, perfect. Well, hit it. There you go, on sense of urgency.
All right. I'm urgent to read. All right, sense of urgency. Continued sense of urgency that makes it difficult to take time to be inclusive, encourage democratic and or thoughtful decision making, to think long term, to consider consequences, or learn from mistakes. Frequently results in sacrificing potential allies for quick or highly visible results. For example, sacrificing interests of communities of color to more quickly win victories for white people, see as default or norm community. Reinforced by funding proposals which promise too much work for too little money, and by funders who expect too much for too little. Anecdotes. Realistic work plans, leadership which understands that things take longer than anyone expects, discussion and planning for what it means to set goals of inclusivity and diversity, particularly in terms of time. Learn from past experience how long things take. Write realistic funding proposals with realistic timeframes. Be clear about how you will make good decisions in an atmosphere of urgency. Realize that rushing decision takes more time in the long run because inevitably people who don't get a chance to voice their thoughts and feelings will at best resent and at worst undermine the decision because they were left unheard.
Thank you so much, Nishala, for reading that.
My pleasure.
Are any questions about the last two? And can I get a volunteer for the next one?
I have a question, Kelly. I don't have any doubt that these are accurate. But I'm curious, how did someone, it would seem like the person who writes this would have to be familiar with a completely different culture in order to pinpoint that this is a quality of white supremacy culture. Is that your understanding of how someone was able to write this?
Yeah. So my understanding of the organization that wrote this is they're a group of psychologists and sociologists and anthropologists. So they've done a lot of study culturally around what we hold as normal versus what other cultures hold, but also what was our culture before this culture. So, like, even though this is named white supremacy culture and I'm naming white culture, every one of us has an ancestral place of origin, right? And in that ancestral place of origin, we were not operating in this way. But something happened. That's still up for investigation and debate. Something happened that created a notion that, like, around sense of urgency. I struggle with sense of urgency. I am one of the most impatient people I know. The only thing that keeps it at bay is my yoga practice. Whenever I feel myself being impatient, I do 4-part breath until I move through it. Because otherwise, I'm going to be rushing everybody, but mostly myself. And for years, like 38 of them, I navigated in that way of I wake up at 5 every morning. I'm out the bed by 5:05 and I'm going until I pass out at 10:45. And I don't know how I survived it. I'm glad I did. But also every time I talk to my mother, who's 69 years old, who could be retired almost 10 years ago, who is not retired, who still has a full roster of activities, social groups, church organizations, and friend groups that she's constantly bang, 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 bang all the time. I'm like, oh, that's why I was socialized to it. I grew up watching my mom do the same thing and her mom also. And while there was and there is some benefits to how they could go, and how I could go, it's not natural and it's not sustainable in the long run. And what I've noticed for myself is it creates a pressure for the people that are around me that I don't want to create. And so, I'll talk about the work that I do in community in our next time together, in our next 2 times. But this one right here, I often am saying to myself, what's the rush? What is the literal rush? I've been pushing a particular fundraiser since August. Now I've pushed it all the way to February, which the part of me that agrees to urgency is well, if we start raising money now, we can raise more. It's but we're not ready to. One of my comrades is dealing with a very ill parent. I am navigating my children being in school for the first time. My other comrade is navigating having a new studio space. Our energy is pulled in all these directions. What we say as an organization is we're going to move at the speed of trust. And right now, February feels like the right time for us to roll that out so that we can all rest in December, have time to work together in January, and potentially start in February. But it might not happen until June either because we just trying to operate outside of it. But much to what it says here is there's this notion that we don't have enough time to talk to everyone, to hear from everyone, to consider everyone's perspective. But as it says right here, you could do it at the front end and take the time that's necessary, or you're going to spend a bunch of time on the tail end trying to repair the harm that you caused. And I'd rather take my time to make the thing right than to have to pull it apart and rebuild it. Do I have a volunteer that'd like to read the next one?
Kelly, could you elaborate on why these problems are cultural? I mean, to my first reaction, these are problems that human failures. I mean, that these are problems of some, individual failures. So in what ways are they cultural?
So the ways that they're cultural is that if people don't operate in these ways, particularly in large organizations or within systems, they are undervalued and treated as abnormal, not good. These are things that, for instance, if you go to a job interview, it's my experience, and say to them, I put my own life over the job I'm going to do for you. So I'll do the job for you that you're hiring me to do after I've fed myself, taken care of my family, rested. People are not going to hire you. They want somebody who's going to really be committed to the work and worry about taking care of themselves and everything else later. And in the same way, inside of an organization, it's been my experience that if you're working on something, let's say diversity and inclusion, and I, the facilitator that they brought in, says to them, you've set a 2-year time frame for solving a problem that's been a problem for 2,000 years. You're not going to be able to do that in 2 years. People meet with a lot of resistance. They're like, of course we can. We're just going to push, 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 push. And for me, the facilitator, to say to them, we have to slow down. We don't have to be so urgent about it. People really aren't able to see that first, and this might feel like a foreign concept to y'all, time is not a real thing. That daylight savings is proof of that. We can change the time whenever we want to. It's not a real thing. And I'm not saying it's not a real thing that we navigate the structure of time. And also the way we calculate time was really just created so that people would work a certain amount of time for others. Before the culture of working that we live in, people didn't have trouble sleeping because our time was connected to our actual circadian rhythm, which is actually connected to our rhythm to the earth. But the sense of urgency that's been created for us is a cultural thing. It's not actually real. If you don't send an email for 2 weeks, it won't be the end of the world. But most of us believe I've got an email, I must respond to it in a 24-hour, like some people tell me, like, I wait 72 hours. I'm like, I wait till I got time. But like we live in that so much so that it feels like, but this is just how things are. And it's like, it's literally not how things are. Not if we don't want them to be. And the danger of them, she kind of talks about up here in this first paragraph, where she says, this is a list of characteristics of white supremacy culture that show up in our organization. Culture is powerful precisely because it's so present and at the same time so very difficult to name or identify. The characteristics listed below are damaging because they're used as norms and standards without being proactively named or chosen by the group. They're damaging because they promote white supremacy thinking. Because we all live in a white supremacy culture, these characteristics show up in attitudes and behaviors of all of us, people of color and white. Therefore, these attitudes and behaviors can show up in any group or organization, whether it's white-led or predominantly white-led, or white or people of color-led or predominantly people of color. And so it's like perfectionism, for example. I leaned into it for a long time. I, in many ways, have been a perfect person. I went to school. I always got good grades. I was just sharing with my children the other day. In 18 years of schooling, I missed 2 days of school. Even when I was sick, I would ask my parents, can I still go to school? Because I didn't want to miss. I didn't want to miss out on what the teacher might say on the note taking. I didn't want to have a mark of being absent. And I carry that across everything in my life until now, of like pushing myself beyond what I actually have the capacity to do, because I don't want to let anyone down. And the reality is, I'm a human being. There are going to be times that, even with you all have experienced that with me, there are times when I cannot be present to the thing that I agree to. It doesn't mean I care less about it or that I don't value you all's time. I also know me coming, for instance, to be with y'all when I had the flu, it would have been terrible. I barely had the energy to even eat, drink water, and take care of myself. Previously, though, if I had not investigated how perfectionism was for me, I would have spent the whole time either trying to force myself to be here or being in a story that you all were going to be disappointed or mad at me because I got the flu, like I did that on purpose. And so it's important for us to think about not just how it shows up like in the organizations that we're in, but how it shows up in ourselves. Because truly the story we're holding and the expectations that we're holding for ourselves, we put them onto other people too, whether we want to or not. And the reality is nobody is perfect. Even, down here where it says making a mistake is confused with being a mistake, that's the main reason people feel shame when they do something wrong, because they think that this means that they are the something wrong. And it's like, no, you just used the wrong words, or didn't have the full information, or didn't have complete understanding, or you were hungry, or you were cold, or you were tired. This doesn't make you a bad person. It's just what you did caused harm. Does that make sense, Jill? I hope that answers your question, Em. If not, let me know. We can keep talking about it.
It's very,
Kelly, this might be a good time to take a break.
Yeah, we definitely can. So it's the 31st minute. Let us just come back at the 45th minute. So you have a chance to grab food if you need to, use the restroom, maybe step outside, and then we'll come back.
Kelly, can I mention one thing to you?
Yeah, sure.
In the very beginning, I'm not sure if I misheard that you would meet with us again in January. I know we're not meeting in December, but we do have a session scheduled on November 30th.
Oh, yeah. I forgot about it. I not forgot about it, but yes, we have that. I meant more like those Wednesday times are like for us to just talk about things, for y'all to ask questions. And our next like lecture workshop time is in January. But thank you for asking for clarity.
Just wanted to double check. Thanks.
Yes, that's good. It's beneficial to your community though to have that in place. Distinguish between being polite and raising hard issues. Don't require those who raise hard issues to raise them in acceptable ways, especially if you're using the ways in which issues are raised as an excuse not to address the issues. And once a conflict is resolved, take the opportunity to revisit it and see how it might have been handled differently. Okay, there's quite a few more on here, and I'm just sharing that for you to take your time in between now and the next time to read them. I think I mentioned it previously that I really recommend printing it. Most of the like larger organizations that I work with, I actually tell them like you should print this and have it handy in your meetings so that when resistance arises, people don't have to take what's happening personally. You can say like, hey, I love you so much, Marina. And right now you're being defensive. So let's think about a way for it. I'm just using you an example because your face is right next to mine on my screen. But it's like, then it's not so personal. It's not just me, Kelly, having a problem with you. It's that we're agreeing to disrupt these things on this sheet. And I love you so much. And I see you leaning into it. And I just want to remind you, you have a different option. So like as an organization, you know, as households, can you pull it out and use it as a tool of self-study for yourself? I have it printed and hanging near where I do my meditation, chanting, and like working, so that when I feel resistance, like an email comes and someone's like, you know what we should do, blah, 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 and they type a whole thing, and I want to type like, no, no, no. It's like, well, wait a minute, let me look at this sheet and see, like, am I being defensive? Is there a sense of urgency that's making me think this isn't possible? Is it that I'm holding a story that there's only one way to do this? Does that make sense to you, how I use it? And so that invitation is there for you all also to just notice, not even do anything about it necessarily, but notice of like, oh, I'm in a sense of urgency, and that's why I'm tapping my foot at the register waiting for someone to check out. Or I feel resistance to what Ramananda said to me, and it's because I think that there's only one right way. Or like on the sheet, they talk about individualism, which is something deeply embedded in American culture, that we should worry about ourselves first and others. And I want to invite that we can take care of everybody. We don't have to think about things as only ours, but that comes up for us a lot, whether it's around our housing, our access to food, the money in our checking account, the cars that we drive, like all of these things. And I mean, I feel grateful to be talking with y'all about it, because I think y'all navigate in a little bit more expansive way because of ashram living and your practice. And still, I'm sure it comes up. Are there questions? Because I want to send y'all into partner groups in just a second.
I don't have a question, but I'll just acknowledge that I'm feeling a little defensive because there's so many things that we could do better.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I hold what we said in the very beginning is that like this is a practice, and defensiveness is going to rise. But even your ability to name that, like, I'm feeling defensive about this, is good medicine, and a good antidote under defensiveness is to just name that a defensiveness is there, because then it's easier to talk about it. It's easier to say, like, I feel protective of this thing that we've made, that we've spent our life building together, and it can feel scary to change it. And also, I mean, I said this to Integral Yoga New Jersey, I've said it to your board in New York. Change is going to be essential for your organization to remain sustainable and viable as the world changes. And, you know, there's a lot of responsibility that you all hold, not necessarily as individuals, but as an organization, because you're one of the oldest yoga organizations. And in most ways, you still operated outside of what the yoga industry does. And the reality is the yoga industry is on the decline. It's crashing, and people are going to grasp at it remaining the same. So you all are at a very critical point when the way that the practice is offered to y'all, the reasons that y'all created an ashram, are going to become more important in this realm. And so, like, can you lead what that change is going to look like? And take your time around it, right? It took time to build this community. Like, what, 40 years? It's been 40 years since Yogananda, Swami Satchidananda came here, or longer, 60 years.
50 years.
50 years, yeah. So it's like, you know, there's these other large organizations, like we can use Lululemon as an example. They're a really young organization. And also there are a lot of what is wrong with the capitalist model of yoga. What they're building, what they've created is not sustainable. So they won't be here in 60 years. The question is, will y'all? And what change will y'all be able to help usher in? Because it's not like you all, it's not as if this was created to make money. That's definitely not why this was created, right? And so it's like, if anybody could culturally lead and bring back that focus, it can be y'all. It's not going to be Lululemon. It's never going to be them. They were created to make money. So that's what they're going to focus on. And I say that with them giving me a lot of money to my organization to their nonprofit, but it's still true. They're not going to change the fact that this is about making a lot of money.
Sarni, go ahead, Sarni. She's ready.
I just want to offer that if you look at perfectionism and the sense of urgency, that Ramananda, you're doing great. That there you are, you know, we don't have to be perfect. We don't have to get all this done next week. This process is ongoing, and we're really embracing moving into all of this. And I'm just so kind of proud of us that we're and like Kelly's saying, we can be in the vanguard here. We can be an example for other organizations. And I think that's a wonderful thing to look, a thing to look forward to. And Kelly, then I do kind of have a question, and it's not anything that we have to address right now, but just as we've been going through this, I've been thinking of the different like teachings, like the yamas and the niyamas and the 4 locks and keys, and how they fit into this document. And I just wonder if we're going to talk about that at any point, or is that something that we'll do towards the end? Or
so that is a part of our conversation next time. I appreciate you bringing, along with talking about change, we are going to talk about how mainly the yamas and niyamas play into this, particularly because we talked about it before, like we all have a responsibility, but part of the definition of responsibility is an opportunity. And so as space holders, as community holders, as community members, how can you teach about this in a way that can be easily absorbed in a 75-minute class, in a passing conversation, at a dinner table with your family, and a walk at the park? And because of the language that we're using, unfortunately, or the language associated with this type of work, people have really strong feelings that can make it hard to like plant a seed. It can make a shell on the outside of folks. And so it's like if, for instance, Sarni, your family is used to you talking about the yamas and the niyamas, it's not going to be a far stretch for you to have a conversation with them about ahimsa, and then connect how ahimsa is also how it could not be honored through how we view housing or how food is distributed. Like, this is very harmful. This isn't ahimsa, and your family or whomever, like your students, your community members, could maybe hear that more than if you went into a class, for instance, and said like, hey, does everybody here have housing? Well, you're living in privilege and people are homeless and you're responsible to change it. Like, that's not gonna like land with people. But if you can talk to people about like, I mean, what I usually do in trainings, that like the practice has certain principles that we are supposed to live into. And for instance, we can't really live into ahimsa if we aren't concerned with how every other human gets access to food. These two things are very much connected, and each of us has different ways to explore it and to think about it. Does that make sense? But we'll talk about it next time.
thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for naming that too. Are there other questions or comments around what we read there on that white supremacy culture document? Okay, well, we're gonna go into small groups. And in these small groups, we're just answering a similar question to the question you answered the first time. And that is, how do some of these things show up in yoga and wellness spaces? You'll be in small partner groups. I'm gonna put the question here in the chat for you. excuse that semicolon, supposed to be an L. How does white supremacy culture show up in yoga? I'm going to put you into small groups, just 2 people. Hold on, let me move some people because some folks had to take space to rest. All right. I want to give you 15 minutes with one another to discuss this, and then we'll come back. Yeah. Everyone should be able to go ahead.
Can I ask a question? So how is this question different from the other? I'm sorry if I...
Yeah, no worries. The last question we were talking about privilege. And so in this question, you have access to this new document. So you want to be thinking specifically about like, how does fear of open conflict show up in wellness and yoga spaces? Or how does perfectionism show up in our practice? Or how does only one right way show up in our community? Or power hoarding, talking more specifically about those particular concepts. Does that answer your question? Perfect. I'm gonna put hold on 1 second. Okie dokie. I'm opening the rooms. It's 3:10 or on the 10th minute here. We'll come back at the 25th minute. I think, Ramananda, I cannot assign you because you're the host. So maybe if you just want to select group 2 and 3, only have 2 people. And I think it didn't allow me to assign Rama either. Oh no, there.
Okay, I'll join group 2.
Okay, see you soon.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Rama, are you okay or need help? Maybe you stepped away also.
think we ended up coming back earlier than Kelly planned, because when I set up the breakout rooms the first time, I put a time limit on it, and that may have automatically applied to this time too. Not sure.
We could, or if we all came back, we could always use this as an opportunity to share the things that we came up with, we found most important.
Yeah, welcome back. We can't, I mean, that's what I was gonna do when we came back anyway. Y'all are just back about 4 minutes early. So if you would want to talk about anything that came up in the discussion, or if there's questions that came up.
Well, I can just share that. Oh, go ahead. Somebody
You
else.
can, it's all right.
But I can just share that in our group, we talked about how being defensive is it's so deeply ingrained in us, or it's such a common tendency. Not that, I don't think that the Institute has particularly embraced or cultivated a culture of defensiveness, but I do see that we have it when there's opportunities to discuss things that could be done better, when there's a need for criticism, that there's a tendency to be defensive or to take things personally. And so we talked about nonviolent communication as a way that something that we might try to bring in as a way of trying to counteract that by creating a culture of good communication, because we need some skills to counteract that sort of tendency. I also really like the idea of trying to cultivate a more sense of appreciation for each other. So those are my thoughts.
No, thank you for naming those things, Ramananda. So being defensive is something that creates a challenge for me in many areas of my life, just because I have to still work on like the value story I have around like making a mistake or disappointing others. I'm just sharing that with y'all. That something that my therapist actually offered to me. I was like, that's yoga, you know, what she said. She's not yoga teacher or anything, but it was like, you know, when something happens, right? When someone comes to you and they say, you hurt me, my feelings, you wasted my time, whatever it is. Can you, one, take a pause? So that pause could look like many different things. It could look like, you know, I'll use Alan and Sarni right here. They could get off of a Zoom and Alan could turn to you, Sarni, and said, you said this thing or did this thing while we were on the thing and it hurt my feelings. And you could respond immediately by saying, like, I didn't mean to hurt your feelings, or you shouldn't have taken it like that, whatever, right? A defensive response. I'm not saying that's what you would do, but you could. And then that could spiral to wherever it spirals to. More conflict is where it would go. Or you could say, wow, thank you for telling me that. I didn't perceive that what I was doing would impact you in that way. You can use different language, but whatever. I'm sorry. And I need time to think about what happened and how I would want to show up differently. And I want to make time to hear from you what would have felt better, been more supportive. And then y'all could move on with the rest of your day, and you can talk about it in 2 days or in a week or in a month when you both feel equipped to talk about it in a way where you're going to be open and listening. And the same thing can happen in your organization. So like, that's one way. I personally, especially when an email or a text message is, I like to call it activating. So when it like makes me be like, oh, I got to defend myself, I like to take 2 days at least before I respond. That doesn't mean I don't type immediately. I just don't send it immediately. And then I'll come back and read it. Inevitably, I want to use less strong language than I used when I initially typed. Sometimes not. Sometimes I'm like, nope, what I wrote 2 days ago is still the thing. I'm gonna give myself 2 more days. And then maybe in a week, I still send that thing I first typed, but at least I know I sent it from a space of reading over it several times to make sure that it actually articulates what I would want to articulate. And the last thing I'll say, my therapist didn't offer me this, but we talked about it previously, is curiosity is always the antidote to defensiveness. Someone, something, some people say to you, the way you do a thing hurts me. Instead of trying to defend yourself, ask more questions about it. Is it the language? Is it the temperature? Is it the tone of voice? Was it the face I was making? And make it clear that you're not asking more questions to make them prove that the thing happened. You're asking really intentional questions so that you have a deeper understanding. I find all the time there isn't a situation where curiosity doesn't relieve some of the resistance. And I'm thinking I have some very resistant relationships in my life. And instead of feeding what might be happening for the other person, I just need to ask as many questions as possible so I can have a clear picture. Then I can know how I'd like to respond. I'm thinking about, like, in particular, I was married to a person for many years, 15 years, and there are 2 children. And co-parenting is not always smooth. We have very different ideas about what it should look like, how it should be exacted, everything. Name a thing, we got different views on it. And so often our communication is via email. It's the best way for us to be clear with one another about what's happening, what we'd like to happen. And sometimes, like 2 days ago, I got a very strongly worded email. And I could have typed what I really wanted to type in that moment. And also what I inevitably sent was a list of questions so that I could have a better understanding, so I can know what boundaries are necessary, how I'd like to respond, how I'd like to proceed. And, like, you have that spaciousness to do that. It's a sense of urgency that makes us think like, oh, I'm sitting right next to Alan and he said that I've hurt him. So now I've got to do something about it and I got to prove that I didn't mean to do it. And it's like, you don't. I assume that you all have had many years together and we'll have many more together. You have plenty of time to talk about how harm has happened, how you'd like to repair it, what you'd like to do different. And I'm just using y'all as an example because y'all are right next to me. I'm on the screen, you can take your time to be curious about a thing. I mean, I'll share, like, for myself, I just had a conversation yesterday with somebody that I've been having for 5 years. We're still figuring it out. We're still figuring out how to move past the harm that occurred. We don't have to be in a rush about it because we plan to be in community and family with each other for the rest of our lives. We don't got to be in a rush. I, as the person who caused harm in this situation, can just listen, ask, like, another great question to ask people after they have shared is like, do you feel complete in sharing? Are there other things that you'd like for me to know about how I'm hurting you or have hurt you? Are there other things that you'd like to know about me? You'd like for me to know about you and your experience that also plays a part in what has just happened? And then lastly, is there something that I could do in this moment to support how you're feeling, to offer you care, to let you know that I hear you and understand you and value what it is you've said to me? I'm telling you right now, this is antidote to almost every single time. And not from a space of trying to, like, handle things quickly, but from a space that as long as you are interacting with other people, whether you have shared identities or not, the potential for you to hurt each other is ongoing. I'm sure across your lives, you all have seen and experienced that. What we have to build our capacity for is how we actually repair those types of harms so that we can continue being in community with one another, continue growing and working together. Just like parenting, for those of you who have parented or caregived, hopefully you feel great about the job you've done. And also the people that you did it for can come back at any time and tell you the thing you said when I was 8, the thing you did when I was 12, the move we made when I was 15. These things caused me harm. They're not saying that you're a bad parent. They're just saying it caused them harm. Can you be curious about that? Can you ask more questions? Can you ask them how they would have wanted it to be different? But more importantly, can you ask them what they need from you right now? Instead of, well, I thought I was doing the best job that I could possibly do. Like, that isn't going to make a person feel heard or understood or that their perspective is valued. And that's going to be true too also for people who might walk into the ashram or come into your class or a person in the grocery store. I was in like a little minor car accident a couple of weeks ago. It wasn't my fault, but someone's car got hit. And the other person I could tell was very agitated when they exited their car. So I just was very quiet and I let them talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. And then I finally said, "Do you feel like complete?" And they were like, "Yeah." And I was like, "Well, what would you like to do?" And they were like, "Nothing." And I was like, "Okay, well, I hope the rest of your day is good. Is there like something that you need from me?" And they were like, "No." And that was the end of it. And then I mean, I have to see the person pretty regularly because our children go to the same school. That's where our car accident was, in primary school. But like, it's been very pleasant to interact with them. And that could have gone so many different ways because they were really agitated when they got out of the car after we got in the accident. And even though the accident wasn't my fault, and they came to that for themselves, initially when they got out the car, it was my fault for them. And I could have gone into a long thing of like, no, you were actually the person in the wrong. But that wouldn't have served the situation and it would have escalated it. My car wasn't damaged, their car wasn't damaged. So it was just like, even if they were, what I was saying to myself is like, just be curious about like what this means for the other person, what they're gonna need, how you're gonna have to navigate their needs, even though I don't know this person. I hope that makes sense for y'all. But like really that's what this document is about. As much as it is connected to race and gender and all of these other things, it's really just this really is just work about how we are the best human we can be for the other human and non-human things that make up the earth that we're living on so that we can be here in right relationship. And it's unfortunate because racism and all other things that we didn't create impact our ability to do that. So then our responsibility is to like investigate it in ourselves, disrupt it all the time. Because I don't actually hold that people who are even violently racist want to be violently racist. They haven't had the space to investigate another way to be. So that's also going to be true for those of us who, like Sneha mentioned, like recognizing their privilege showing up in that interaction. They weren't entering it maliciously, but also them noticing that about themselves change that interaction for them and will potentially change all interactions moving forward. And really these documents that I'm offering to you, even though they can be activating, they're really just tools for self-study. Are there other thoughts or things that came?
Oh, Kelly, I would just say that describing it as white supremacy culture, I mean, you could also say it was basically capitalism, because it's like night and day at the ashram and how people treat each other than it was, in my job, because the organization that's under pressure to make money, they don't prioritize the feelings of their employees. They're looking at making money. But at IYI, I mean, it's like a case study of people trying to be considerate and do the things that we're talking about. And that's really a breath of fresh air.
Yeah, I definitely agree and appreciate you naming it. I mean, Ramananda and I talked about it before I came to work with you all, that I was pretty sure I was done doing these trainings. I am done after you all are the last group that I'm doing this type of training with. But also like me, Kelly, personally, I've had a very transformative experience because of my ability to be at yoga on multiple occasions, probably 12 times over the last 10 years. And even though my particular lineage is not through Swami Satchidananda, my original teacher was heavily impacted by this lineage. And so it was a large part of how I was introduced to the practice. And it is like night and day. Like I think I might have said it to y'all, but previously when I lived in North Carolina and I would be at the ashram, I was like leading a retreat. I've only visited one time for like leisure. Every other time I'm there like leading or facilitating in some way. And also it doesn't really feel like it because I don't have to make my own meals and like everyone is so kind and friendly and helpful, and like it's a gift to have complete silence for an hour a day, especially because I have two small children. So I like love that meditation happens and everybody got to be quiet and you got to be quiet while you eat your food at first and you're like reading, and there is this focus on people. And also because people are coming to the ashram from the world, they're bringing that, and there's like a period of unlearning. And when we talk about like racism, unfortunately, it's something that Americans particularly are socialized not to talk about. And because we don't talk about it, I mean, I've seen it happen at Yogaville and in Yogaville spaces and ashram spaces connected. But for me, it doesn't change how I feel about Swami Satchidananda or all the folks that are devotees or practitioners in the space. But it is still an important conversation to hold, that like the same way you might have brought your work culture with you and it took you time to realize like that culture doesn't apply here. The same is true for all of us around racism, homophobia, or ageism. I think ageism is a really important conversation for you all to start having, because many of the people that I see as power holders and decision makers within your organization are living beyond their 6th, 7th, 8th, maybe even 9th decade, which means that their time of leadership is drawing to a close just because of the finite amount of physical time that we each have here on the earth. And so it's like, how do we figure out how to bridge the distance between much younger people, and I mean like children, and the ashram space, right? Of like, I of course see children at the ashram. My own children have been to Yogaville twice. And also there was a time when there was a lot of children that have now grown up to be adults who also have children. And like, how do we re-engage their connection to what y'all have built? Because many of them are navigating a world that, to your point, Alan, is very different than what is at the ashram. How do we, I don't want to say tap into, but reconnect to the next generation of people that will carry forward this lineage in this community? Because I think the pressure to live in a way that's different than the ashram is very different than even how I experienced it. The internet did not exist when I was a child. I'll be 42. The first computer we had in our house that had internet, I was 18. And I just told my children like 2 months ago, like the internet didn't exist when I was your age. We just like went to the library and we looked in books, and the information might be old. And you might not know the real, that's why you had to like use magazines. We were talking about sourcing, like getting sources for documentation. And like right now you can just type on the computer and anything you want to see is available to you, essentially. That's not how it always was. And while that could be good, as we can. Does that make sense? Can y'all still hear me?
It's a little hard to hear, Kelly.
Yeah, she's saying.
Oh, she's figured it out.
Yeah.
My AirPods died.
I was hoping to share as well.
Yeah, sure, Nishala. Thank you for that, Alan.
Sure.
Well, it's definitely piggybacking on what you said. And first off, I just want to thank you for taking your time to do this with us. These trainings are a great privilege, and I'm very grateful that we have this opportunity to learn and better ourselves. With that being said, words in general are a privilege in a way that I definitely notice my own, I guess it sounds so like nefarious white supremacy tendencies coming out with words and my judgments of other people based on their ability to speak, which is super silly because someone's ability to speak in English has little to nothing to do with how well they're able to perform a task that has nothing to do with speaking. Yeah. I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. That's fine. No, I appreciate you sharing that because, in our list of privileges, the reality is because of the way America positions itself, being a person who speaks English does add value to you in an outside system. It doesn't actually add value to you, but even to Alan's point, I definitely know people who have accents for various reasons, whether it's a speech impediment, because English is not their first language, because they were raised in a multi-language household. And that is not viewed generally as a positive thing. There's the notion that they should try to fix their voice, speak in a different way. Even for myself, I was raised speaking English, and I'm from the American South, and my dad was not from the South. And my dad had a lot of thoughts about having a Southern accent. And so it was something that I'm very well practiced at hiding, but also comes out because I'm from the South. And even as an adult, experiencing people, I was just talking to my partner about it recently, people questioning my intelligence because I have a Southern accent. And yeah, and I'm still speaking English, but I can only imagine what people navigate when they have an accent, when English is not their first language. And I'm in family with people that is the case. And I see, I was in a grocery store recently, and the person ringing out was speaking English, and they had an accent. And the person being rung out said something like, "I can't understand anything you're saying. It doesn't even sound like you're speaking English." And I don't know, it was just so rude, but it was in line with what you're sharing, Mashallah, of like this story that you can understand this person because the rest of us can understand this person. You're just making up a story about your ability to understand them. And I'm not saying that the person might not have understood everything, but it was their privilege around being in America and being an English speaker, and thinking that you could speak down to someone because English is not their first language. It makes me think of an article that I actually want to share with y'all called The Language of Animacy. I'm going to send it before the end of our time, but it makes me think of that. So thank you for sharing that too. Are there other thoughts about the document or the time you had in your small groups that you'd love to talk about or want to share?
I just wanted to share a quick thought if no one else wanted to, about homelessness. I make the joke that when I see someone homeless with a dog, that perhaps it was the dog that made the person homeless. Like maybe it got sick and the vet bill was very expensive, and then things happened and they ended up on the street. But it's not a joke in any way. And it happens. And I think it's really important just to remind ourselves that any one of us could be homeless at any minute. Like I could definitely go about my day and do things in a way that would leave me without a home, maybe by the end of the week, by the month, and we're no better or worse than anyone else, and we're all humans. Pardon me, I joined a little late, so I didn't hear the entire talk about the homelessness, but I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that, Inshallah. It's something that I grew up with my parents, like providing food. And I mean, one time when I was 10, my dad and I were out, and my dad saw someone and they were about to be arrested because they were urinating on the side of a building. And it ended up that was one of my dad's childhood friends. And so without talking to my mother, my dad brought this person home to live with us, which it ended up being fine. My dad is deceased, but my parents remain in friendship with this person. They lived with us for about 3 weeks, but essentially they could not get a job because they did not have a permanent address. And I think that a lot of us, or a lot of people, don't recognize that like you said, illness. I mean, in the last 3 years, the amount of people who have been sick that have required hospitalization while they have no insurance or the resources to pay those bills, or even the flexibility to miss work while they're sick, is a real thing while the price of housing skyrockets in our country. And so we could spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to solve that problem. Or we could, in small communities, figure out how just to house people while other people who might have more power figure out how to solve those problems. But we'll talk about it in our next 2 sessions. But a lot of my encouragement in my own practice is not around how to fix these things because they're working the way that they were designed to work. It's more around how to make new systems and ways of existing that are separate from those. And I think because of you all's history, because of creating ashrams in a Western culture where people live communally and share resources with one another, I think that you all are like a few steps ahead of some other places. And it would be, I look forward to seeing where you all are in 5 or 10 years around choosing to investigate racism and homophobia and socioeconomic accessibility in your organization. And also how you all could, I think someone said, like, be a vanguard around how this practice is used to serve versus what is common, using it as a business model. Because it's not what y'all have done. But I think a lot of people probably don't know that either. And, there's there's an opportunity for you all to be really expansive about how you do it and also be educating other people about what's possible for them as individuals and outside of your community. I hope that makes sense. I shared the link to the article that I was talking about. It was so I really love this article. I read it quite a bit. It's great to read in nature. So if you're a person who likes to go to for walks or sit in the park or hike to your favorite place, bike to your favorite place, and then go and read this article. It's not really, it is connected to the work that we're doing, but it's more about how limiting the English language actually is in our experience. It's a really great resource. We're coming close to the end of our time. I want to take a moment to just talk about any homework. The only homework is for you to stay looking at, investigating, and thinking about the white culture document that we talked about earlier. We're going to be together on Wednesday the 30th for community feedback. So that's a great time to bring any questions that you might have. And then we're together again in January. I don't have the date right here on the top of my head, but I know it's in my calendar. Then we'll be together in January to talk about change, talk about some other things. And then we'll have a community session between. And then our last time we'll work on some plans. You all will work on some plans with my support around next steps for yourselves as individuals, but also as a community. Okay. Perfect. I would love for you all to make sure that you drink water or your favorite beverage of choice. I would love for you all to take really great care of yourselves between now and our next time together on November 30th. If you do have questions or need to talk to me outside of this space, again, I'm sharing my email address, which is just my full name, Kelly Nicole Palmer @gmail.com. Feel free to reach out to me or send me an email. But yeah, if there's not any other questions, we can, if you all want to do a closing. Ramananda, do you want to close with some om?
Yes. Let's chant this Loka Samast. Looks like I'm still muted.
You're not, we can hear you.
Okay. Let's chant the Loka Samasta mantra as a way of sending whatever benefit we've received outward. We can chant 3 times. Loka samasta sukhino bhavantu. Loka samasta sukhino bhavantu. Loka samasta sukhino bhavantu. May the entire universe be filled with peace and joy, love and light. Jai Sri Satguru Maharaj Ki Jai.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kelly.
Yes, see you all soon.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Good night or good afternoon. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Kelly.